In 1968, the skies over Vietnam belonged to the enemy. American pilots were falling at an alarming rate, and the culprit was clear: the Soviet MiG-21. Fast, agile, and deadly, it outmatched nearly everything the United States could put in the air. Every dogfight was a gamble, and too often, American pilots were losing. What you just saw was one file. The Cold War was fought in secrets like this. Cold War black files is where those stories resurface. Subscribe. New files declassified. The statistics were grim. In the early years of the air war over North Vietnam, American kill ratios were plummeting. For every enemy aircraft shot down, the US was losing planes at nearly equal rates. This was unacceptable. During the Korean War, American fighters had achieved kill ratios of 10-1 or better. Now, as against the North Vietnamese flying Soviet aircraft, that advantage had evaporated. Pilots were coming home with stories of an enemy fighter that could climb faster, turn tighter, and disappear before they could get a shot off. The Pentagon was desperate for answers. Billions of dollars had been poured into developing advanced fighters like the F-4 Phantom, loaded with sophisticated missiles and cutting-edge technology. Yet in the brutal reality of combat, American pilots were being outflown by an enemy using simpler, cheaper aircraft. The question wasn't just tactical anymore, it was existential. If the United States couldn't control the skies over Vietnam, what hope did it have in a larger conflict with the Soviet Union? Back home, in the scorching Nevada desert, something extraordinary was taking place. Hidden from the world at a remote airstrip near Area 51, a secret project was underway. Its codename, Have Doughnut. The mission, to turn the tables on the Soviets by doing the unthinkable, flying their own aircraft against them. The story begins not in America, but in the Middle East. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli forces had captured an intact Soviet MiG-21 after an Iraqi pilot, disoriented and low on fuel, mistakenly landed at an Israeli airbase. The pilot, Captain Munir Redfa, wasn't lost, he was defecting. Redfa was an Assyrian Christian who had faced discrimination in the Iraqi military and had been secretly recruited by Israeli intelligence in an operation that took months to plan. When he touched down at Hatzor Air Base in Israel, he brought with him the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secret. The Israelis understood its value immediately. This wasn't just a fighter jet. It was a complete intelligence package. Every rivet, every wire, every line of code in its systems represented years of Soviet research and development. Within hours of the landing, Israeli engineers were swarming over the aircraft, photographing every detail. But the Israelis also knew they couldn't fully exploit this prize alone. They needed American expertise, American resources, and American test facilities. In a clandestine arrangement brokered at the highest levels of government, they agreed to hand the MiG over to the United States. The price was never publicly disclosed, but intelligence sharing agreements were strengthened, and American military aid to Israel increased significantly in the years that followed. The MiG was disassembled with surgical precision. Every component was catalogued, photographed, and packed for transport. The operation had to be invisible. If the Soviets discovered that one of their frontline fighters was in American hands, the intelligence value would evaporate. They would change designs, alter tactics, and modify training. The element of surprise was everything. Under the cover of darkness, the components were loaded onto transport aircraft. The shipment was disguised as agricultural equipment. Manifests were falsified. Even the flight crews weren't told what they were carrying. The aircraft flew a circuitous route, hopping between Allied air bases, always staying out of Soviet surveillance range. Finally, the pieces arrived in the United States and were trucked to their destination, Groom Lake, Nevada, Area 51. The facility was already infamous within the aerospace community as the test site for the U-2 spy plane and other black projects. Its remote location, surrounded by restricted military ranges, made it perfect for testing aircraft that weren't supposed to exist. Now it had a new purpose: to dissect the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter. Reassembling the MiG was a puzzle that took weeks. Soviet engineering was different from American practices. Tolerances were looser. Materials were unfamiliar. The documentation, all in Russian, had to be translated and interpreted. American engineers worked alongside defectors and intelligence analysts who understood Soviet systems. Slowly, painstakingly, the MiG-21 took shape in a hangar that officially didn't exist. When it was finally ready, the question became, who would fly it? And the aircraft was an unknown quantity. Its systems were foreign, its handling characteristics a mystery. Flying it was dangerous, and doing so in the restricted airspace above Area 51 meant there would be no rescue if something went wrong. The pilots selected were among the best test pilots in the country, men who had flown everything from experimental jets to captured German aircraft after World War II. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. Their families were told they were on routine training exercises. The first flight was cautious, exploratory. The pilot took off, climbed to altitude, and performed basic maneuvers. The MiG responded smoothly, confirming that the reassembly had been successful. But this was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the test program intensified. Pilots pushed the aircraft harder, testing its limits, and deliberately inducing stalls and spins to see how it would react. What they discovered changed everything. The MiG-21 was fast in a straight line, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2 under the right conditions. Its acceleration was impressive, and its climb rate was superior to most American fighters. But it had flaws, and those flaws were significant. The aircraft's turning radius was wider than American fighters. In a sustained dogfight, the MiG would lose energy rapidly, its speed bleeding off with each hard turn. The engines, powerful but temperamental, were prone to flaming out under certain high-G maneuvers, particularly at high altitudes. The fuel consumption was enormous, giving the aircraft limited endurance in combat. The radar system was primitive compared to American technology, yet with a short detection range and difficulty tracking targets in ground clutter. Most critically, the cockpit visibility was poor. The pilot sat low in the fuselage with limited visibility to the rear and sides. In a turning fight, an American pilot could maintain visual contact while a MiG pilot would lose sight of his opponent. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a fatal flaw in aerial combat where losing sight of your enemy, even for a second, could mean death. The control systems also revealed Soviet design philosophy. Where American aircraft favored stability and ease of handling, the MiG was designed to be flown by highly trained pilots who could manage its quirks. It was unforgiving of mistakes. In the hands of an expert, it was formidable. But the average pilot would struggle with its demanding handling characteristics. Armed with this knowledge, American tacticians went to work. They developed new combat maneuvers specifically designed to exploit the MiG's weaknesses. The tactics were counterintuitive, going against years of established doctrine. Instead of trying to outrun the MiG in a straight line or outclimb it, American pilots were taught to force the MiG into turning fights where it would bleed energy. They learned to attack from the MiG's blind spots, using the poor cockpit visibility against it. They practiced inducing situations where the MiG's engines would flame out, leaving it vulnerable. The data was compiled into classified briefings and distributed to fighter squadrons. But reading about the MiG's weaknesses wasn't the same as experiencing them, and pilots needed to face the aircraft in combat to feel its strengths and limitations firsthand. And so, Have Doughnut evolved into something even more ambitious, a full-scale adversary training program. The captured MiG became an aggressor aircraft. American F-4 Phantoms and other frontline fighters were brought to Area 51 to engage in mock combat against the Soviet jet. These weren't gentle training exercises. They were brutal, realistic engagements flown at the edge of the aircraft's capabilities. Pilots who made mistakes paid for them with simulated deaths. Those who learned survived. The training revealed something unexpected. American pilots had been fighting the wrong war. They had been trained for high-altitude, long-range missile engagements, relying on radar and sophisticated weapon systems. But over Vietnam, and political restrictions often prohibited the use of long-range missiles, and engagements were happening at close range where traditional dogfighting skills mattered. The pilots who had trained against the actual MiG understood this. They learned to trust their instincts, to maneuver aggressively, to close with the enemy and win in knife fight ranges. The impact was immediate and measurable. Pilots who had gone through the aggressor training program and then deployed to Vietnam began achieving kills at dramatically higher rates. They returned from missions with reports of successful engagements using the exact tactics developed at Groom Lake. The MiG-21, once feared as an invincible opponent, became predictable. American pilots knew its moves before the enemy pilots made them. Word spread quietly through the fighter community. And those who had flown against the real MiG became informal instructors, passing on their knowledge to squadron mates. The tactics evolved and improved with each combat engagement, creating a feedback loop of continuous improvement. In 1969, the Navy took the lessons from Have Doughnut and formalized them into a new institution. It was called the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, established at Naval Air Station Miramar in California. The world would come to know it by another name: Top Gun. Top Gun wasn't just another training program. It was a revolution in how fighter pilots were educated. The curriculum was built on the intelligence gathered at Area 51. The best pilots in the Navy were brought in, not just to learn, but to be transformed into tacticians who could think like the enemy. Instructors, and many of whom had flown the actual MiGs in Nevada, brought an unmatched level of realism to the training. They flew American aircraft painted in Soviet camouflage schemes, using Soviet tactics, forcing the students to adapt and overcome. The results spoke for themselves. By the early 1970s, Navy pilots trained at Top Gun were achieving kill ratios that dwarfed anything seen earlier in the war. The numbers climbed from barely 1-to-1 to 12-to-1 and higher. The school became legendary, its graduates sought after by every squadron in the fleet. But Have Doughnut didn't stop with one aircraft. The program's success led to an expansion. Over the years, more Soviet fighters were acquired through covert channels. Defectors brought their aircraft across borders, and allies who had captured Soviet equipment quietly transferred it to American custody. Intelligence operations that remain classified to this day secured additional examples of MiG-17s, MiG-19s, and later models of the MiG-21. Each aircraft was flown, tested, and analyzed with the same rigor as the first. A fleet of Soviet fighters began to accumulate at Area 51 and other secure locations. The testing became more sophisticated, incorporating electronic warfare, different weapon systems, and various combat scenarios. American engineers reverse-engineered Soviet technology, discovering not just how it worked, but why the Soviets had made specific design choices. The knowledge gained from these flights created a comprehensive understanding of Soviet aviation doctrine, capabilities, and limitations. Analysts could predict how Soviet tactics would evolve because they understood the constraints of the aircraft. When new Soviet fighters appeared, American intelligence had a baseline for comparison, a framework for understanding what the enemy could and couldn't do. This wasn't just about winning dogfights. It was an intelligence operation of staggering scope. Every flight, every test, every mock engagement was a piece of a larger puzzle. The United States was performing an autopsy on the Soviet military-industrial complex, one aircraft at a time. The information gathered influenced everything from aircraft design to strategic planning. American defense contractors incorporated lessons from the MiG studies into their own designs, avoiding the flaws and sometimes adopting the innovations. The program also had a psychological dimension. Knowing the enemy's capabilities with such precision gave American commanders confidence in their planning. They could calculate risk accurately, deploy forces effectively, and anticipate enemy responses. The fog of war never fully lifts, but Have Doughnut made it considerably thinner. The Soviets never knew. For years, their most advanced technology was being dissected in the Nevada desert, while they remained oblivious. Soviet pilots continued flying their aircraft according to doctrine, unaware that every tactic, every maneuver, every weakness had been catalogued and countered. The psychological advantage was immense. When American and Soviet pilots met in combat, one side had already fought the battle dozens of times in training. The other was encountering the situation for the first time. There were close calls. Our Soviet intelligence was always probing, always searching for leaks. The operational security around Have Doughnut was absolute. Pilots and ground crew were compartmentalized, knowing only what they needed to know. Flights were conducted during hours when Soviet reconnaissance satellites weren't overhead. Communication was strictly controlled. Even decades later, many of the personnel involved refused to discuss their work, taking their secrets to the grave. Have Doughnut remained classified for decades. The pilots who flew the MiGs were forbidden from speaking about it. The mechanics who maintained them, the engineers who studied them, the strategists who built tactics around them, all were bound by secrecy. Even after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, the full extent of the program remained hidden. The government's official position was ambiguous, neither confirming nor denying the rumors that circulated in aviation circles. When the truth finally began to emerge through declassified documents and the accounts of aging veterans, it revealed a story of ingenuity, daring, and calculated risk. The United States had taken the enemy's greatest weapon and turned it into a teacher. The lessons learned in the skies above Area 51 didn't just save lives, they shifted the balance of power in the Cold War. The program's influence extended far beyond Vietnam. The adversary training concept pioneered by Have Doughnut became doctrine. The Air Force established its own aggressor squadrons. Allied nations requested access to the intelligence. The fundamental principle, know your enemy intimately, train against realistic threats. I never assume superiority, became embedded in military culture. Today, the legacy of Have Doughnut lives on. The adversary training it pioneered is now standard practice in air forces around the world. Top Gun, though it has evolved and relocated, remains the gold standard for fighter pilot training. Modern aggressor squadrons fly aircraft that simulate current threats, continuing the work that began with that captured MiG-21. And the principles developed during those secret flights. Understand your enemy, exploit their weaknesses, train relentlessly, continue to define modern aerial combat. The aircraft themselves, those captured Soviet fighters that changed history, eventually found their way to museums and secure storage facilities. Some were flown until they could no longer be maintained. Others were preserved as testaments to one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Cold War. A few remain classified, locked away in facilities that still don't officially exist. The MiG-21 may have ruled the skies in 1968, but it was the last time the Soviets held that advantage. In the Nevada desert, in the hands of American test pilots who pushed beyond every limit, the king was dethroned. The Soviet Empire, confident in its technological superiority, never realized it was being dissected piece by piece, flight by flight, until the knowledge gained made that superiority irrelevant, and the world never saw it coming.